Okay, now, from the beginning.
Hit it, boys.
Hello and welcome to the Insight Business Podcast by The Office Space, a monthly business talk series that brings together innovative entrepreneurs and business leaders to explore trending topics and discuss the secrets of their success under a monthly theme. This month, we take a sobering look at climate change, the most serious challenge facing the world. We speak with 3 sustainability crusaders making waves for a better future. Our guests are Claire Press, Vogue's sustainability editor, sustainable fashion crusader, podcaster at Wardrobe Crisis, and author. Rod Simpson, architect, urban planner, and environment commissioner at the Greater Sydney Commission. And Ronnie Khan, founder and CEO at Oz Harvest, United Nations Environment Partner and international speaker. The Insight Business Podcast is brought to you by Habituous Media, Golden Age Cinema, and InDesign.
And I think what's really lovely is it's the true sense of the word sustainability. We do associate with the environment, but it actually, when you take that broader definition, it's about something being able to continue without depleting resources for future generations. So it's incredible work that you're doing, Jane. So we have 3 incredible panellists tonight, and like I said, it's a topic that is perhaps no more important than this. Over the past 150 years, we've changed the balance of our planet living beyond our means. We've burnt huge amounts of fossil fuel, bred huge amounts of methane-producing livestock, and cut down vast swathes of forest, which would naturally absorb the carbon dioxide. So it's really sobering. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that a 1.5 degree average rise may put 20 to 30% of the species at extinction. And if the planet warms to more than 3%, then most ecosystems, including us, will struggle. So I think when we look down the barrel of global catastrophe, it's a pretty insurmountable challenge, but luckily there is this groundswell of, like we said, corporate crusaders and standout ambassadors and climate change champions. So I am delighted to introduce the panel. I felt that they did not really need me to read out their achievements, so I'll skim over that because we all know who they are and their brilliance, and you can see it on the room sheet. But I've asked 3 people to who know them well to give their own précis. So perhaps we'll start with Claire Press, which Claire is Vogue's Australian Sustainability Editor, which is the first in the world. She's also a sustainable fashion podcaster, a crusader, a podcaster, author, journalist, incredible woman. But I asked Naomi, who's in front of me from Lock the Gate. Lock the Gate gets a really great rap in Rise and Resist, the book. And she says of Claire, I feel like you need to look at each other while I'm reading this. So Claire celebrates the best in all of us. She's bold, well-researched, fabulous, joyful, and deadly serious. It only takes a moment with Claire to recognise her generous spirit, sharp mind, and gutsy confidence. She's on a mission, our mission, and there's room for all of us to join her. Her research and writing is on point with a passionate flair that draws us in and gets us bursting to be part of what's needed in the world right now. Go Claire! Claire, take the stage! I know.
Thank you very much.
So come and sit here right in tight with me. Now, Rod Simpson. So Rod is an architect and urban planner, associate professor of incredible, different universities as well you've been involved with, but also the inaugural Environmental Commission for the Greater Sydney Commission. Anyone who spends time with Rod seems transfixed by his genius, and there's been like 3 or 4 different people have come up to me and just wax lyrical about him. But the always effervescent Councillor Jess Scully has said with unbelievable enthusiasm, you're actually there, Naomi, Rod is actually a genius. He doesn't think like anyone else. I need to kind of capitalise all of this. He's genuinely a visionary person and able to combine so many tracks of history and literary and social and psychological movement and coalesce it into a vision. He is a big picture visionary person, taking difficult to grasp concepts and making them poetic and relatable. Take the stage, please, Rod. Come close to me. More.
Jess next time.
Look, it's not just her. There's a list of them. I had to choose the best quotes. And then our third guest, we all know Ronnie Khan. She's been doing incredible work for 14 years with Oz Harvest, and you've taken this from one van in Sydney to right around the world, and certainly showing no sign of stopping, Ronnie. I spoke to Vince Frost. He's actually in New York at the moment, but we were talking and he was really just so, again, positive about the work that you guys have been doing. He started branding in 2010 for Oz Harvest and has been involved in that signature, the truck logo, and some really fun stuff with disfigured fruit, doing incredible campaigns. So what Vince says of Ronnie, it's impossible to say no to Ronnie. She can move mountains, whether it's creating a cookbook in less than 8 months when publishers told it would take 2 years, feeding 5,000 people in Martin Place with rescued food, or getting top chefs and CEOs to cook for the homeless. Anything is possible with Ronnie. She's driven by purpose and is focused and determined around living a life of purpose on purpose. She should be knighted for her efforts. Please, Ronnie, take the stage. Now, hopefully you're all in nice and close. Come a little bit closer to me. We'll all bunch
I'm just going to look at the wine with lust for the whole time.
Take it.
They need a cushion.
I know. So I'm going to get each of them to explain a little bit about what they do. So, Rod, we're looking at the Greater Sydney Commission. That's 12,000 square metres.
Kilometres.
It's huge. It's 600 suburbs are involved in this. 650 suburbs and 35 local councils. What do you do?
Well, just very briefly to explain the way the Commission works, Sydney's divided up into 5 different districts, and so there's the Chief Commissioner, who happens to be Lucy Turnbull, and then there's a Social, Environment and Economic Commissioner. But then we're thematic, if you like, so we're pushing those agendas, if you like. And then there's 5 district commissioners who really bridge between the state government and local government. So the whole idea with the Commission, which is quite new, is that it's really trying to develop new lines of communication, new forms of collaboration, integration. Because I think the public probably thinks that we've got a seamlessly crystalline structure in government. I mean, that's not really the way it works. And so really you need organisations and processes to cut through things sometimes. Cut's probably the wrong term, but to actually integrate across things and bring both people but also processes together in ways that they haven't been brought together. So my role is to, I suppose, paint the vision. And so the narrative, if you like, is 3 pillars, silos, or legs of the stool, whatever. The city and its landscape, which gives due regard to where the city's come from, being cared for tens of thousands of years. The efficient city, which is about our impacts and so forth. But importantly, the third one is a resilient city, and I might talk about that a bit more later. But that's my job is to, I suppose, to enthuse people, but also to try and have a sort of coherent framework of sorts that will be continually changing, but to bring people together to actually empower people and join people together who might not have been speaking before. That's really the role. And
it's independent. It's been appointed by...
It's independent to the extent that any organisation that's part of government can be independent of... So, we're not completely wild. I mean, of course, it's part of a process of being in government where that also is part of the task to... I have to confess I hadn't come across the word socialise before in terms of the internal workings of processes to the extent that I have now. But that's what it's about. It's really about socialising means simply to be going out and talking to many people and not convincing them so much, but actually listening and then developing some sort of coherent, shared idea about what we should be doing.
And I like to think of the Commission almost like the innovation lab in a corporate sense, that you're kind of the nimble, fast, kind of innovative version. Try to be. Okay. We'll explore that. Claire, as the first of your kind, what does a sustainability editor do?
The first of my kind. It's interesting times. I'm kind of making it up as I go along in a way. So I was made Vogue's sustainability editor in March. It's the first time they've had a sustainability editor, but there are no others in the world that we're aware of. So it's pioneering. And that's testament to the vision of Edwina McCann and Sophie Tedmondson, who really pushed this, and it's exciting. But it's my role to, I guess there's a conventional editorial role. So I contribute stories to the magazine around things like future fabrics, the circular economy, fashion and feminism. I then have a role which is about trying to liaise with the wider fashion community in Australia to try to move them towards sustainable change. And then I'm doing that internationally on a platform where I'm talking with big business and with the fashion industry globally about how we can steer this conversation towards making fashion more sustainable. And I think, okay, we're here talking about climate change. So if any of you are like, well, what's that got to do with Vogue or some fashion woman? Actually, climate change is integral to the way that we produce clothes. Fashion is a global industry. If any of you listen to my podcast, I'm going to sound like a broken record. But it's a really interconnected industry. It's huge. It impacts loads of different stages of the supply chain, which is also very, very complex. So it's from farm or seed, if you like, all the way through to runway and to retail. So there are so many touch points along that supply chain, and it can have huge effects on people and planet. And I guess just to kind of put in context what we're talking about today with climate change and activism, when we talk about sustainability in fashion, it's a really broad term and it's quite hard to pin it down, but we have tended until now to look at people and planet, and the people side of it is about the potential for either elevating and treating with dignity workers in the supply chain or exploiting them. But the planet piece has hitherto been more about like water use, pesticide use, the possibility of polluting waterways. We haven't really got to the point where it's broadly talked about, this idea of fashion impacting climate. That it's coming.
And circular economy, I want to unpack a little bit as well. So Ronnie, for you, you are doing incredible things as United Nations Environment Partner on the National Strategy for Food Waste, but also driving your little yellow car around Sydney and everything. Tell us about a typical day in your life.
Oh, goodness, I don't think you want to hear about that. I guess I do quite a lot of public speaking. So I had an interesting day today. I had meetings with potential high net worth individuals who actually had a brilliant idea, the one good thing that he said. There wasn't a lot else. But what he said was, why doesn't politics and why do politicians, both sides, all parties, put climate change at the center? Let that be an issue that's off the political agenda. And I had to say, well, that was why it was worth seeing him this morning. And then today's my one-on-ones with all my team, so it's jam-packed back to back. But really, our purpose is to nourish our country. And for us, it's to do that in as many ways as possible. In particular, we rescue, we educate, we engage, and we innovate. Rescue is really what we do. That's what all of you know. You see those yellow vans, and that's what you think of as our harvest. But actually, we've got 5 education programs, which are actually what is going to shift and change our world, because it's teaching us, all of us, how not to waste food. It's teaching vulnerable people how to live a more sustainable life, how to cook, how to purchase, how to look after themselves and nourish themselves. It's youth and how we break the cycle of intergenerational poverty, so that those kids can get a better chance, and we put them through hospitality training. And it's vulnerable people. It's our school program. It's which is now STEM curriculum accredited in New South Wales, but could roll out around the whole country to teach years 5 and 6 how to be sustainable, how to cook, how to purchase, all the things that we hope that we all know how to do. But if $20 billion worth of food is still going to waste, and 10 billion of that is caused by us, somewhere we have to break that cycle. Our system is broken.
And I want to look at the origin story for each of you, because Claire, in your book, Rise and Resist, it's about these incredible people and organisations, but I think they're everyday people. So perhaps you can tell us about your entry into this sustainability world.
I love that you brought up everyday people, because I'm an everyday person. I'm not an expert. I might be a bit of a fashion expert, hemlines. I know what was on the Chanel runway, but I'm not an expert in activism. I'm not an expert in climate action or climate change or the science behind it, or any of the things in which I try to delve into zero waste, all of that. But I do strongly believe that we all have the power to make change in our own worlds, and that there's a quote at the beginning of my book, which is Gloria Steinem, and it's like, a movement is only people moving, and the future depends on what each of us does every day. So I come at this from that. My interest in sustainability and into ethical fashion came from Rana Plaza. And I'm sure that all of you would remember that factory disaster that happened in April 2013. And I won't go over it again, but just suffice to say the numbers of people who were killed in this terrible accident where the buildings collapsed were astronomical. It was 1,138 people. And I don't mind saying that over and over again, even though you've probably heard it before, because I think we need to centre remembering what that meant, and that this is people who make our clothes. So for me, that's like a macro thing, but then I brought that home and thought, well, okay, I work in this industry. Am I culpable? What do I have to do with this system? And I started to question just how broken the system was. And Ronnie, it was so interesting to hear you use that phrase about the broken system. We often talk in fashion about how it's way behind food. So food was the leader in terms of getting mass, and you might disagree with me, but we think of it like that. Like that
14 years overnight success.
Right. But 14 years ago, no one was talking about sustainable fashion. And no one was talking about fashion waste. And so I think we're behind with food, but we can take learnings from that. And, you know, just to wrap that up, I think the system is broken, but it's up to us to reform it and to reshape it into a system that works. And I think that's really possible.
Yeah. And for you, Rod, your parents, you were saying, were naturalists. They were always interested in environment, but it wasn't until you were involved in the first Green Olympics that you started to take this path. Tell us about your story.
Okay, well, I leaving aside the childhood part, where my parents did have a bookshop and so on, but I went into landscape architecture, which I think is a great way to start. Start with the geology and the plants, and then I shifted across to architecture. And as many architects in the early 90s, there was a bit of a downturn. I was out of work. So I rang up a friend who happened to work at Greenpeace on the climate and coast campaign. And Greenpeace at that stage was shifting from bearing witness to thinking about being much more engaged. It was when Paul Gilding was the CEO, or he became the CEO international. And that was a real shift for Greenpeace. And they approached them and said, look, you know, for a really knockdown price, I'll put in a couple of entries for a couple of competitions, and if we win, fantastic, and if we don't, you've got some nice pictures, you know, to illustrate some of the propositions. And then we won both those competitions, one of which was the Olympic Village groups, and that led then to the greening of the games and so on. There were 5 first place winners, I should say. Yeah. But that really, I suppose more than anything else, it started to indicate that you could illustrate and engage with people about alternatives. And it did mean that we got a bit of that work, not a lot, because people who are environmentalists tend to not have any money, you know, so and they've got a lot of ideas which they'd like you to draw up, you know, so thanks very much. But seriously, then that led to other things, and I suppose it was the discipline of working with Greenpeace and people in Greenpeace that I'm not a genius, for goodness sake, but just the discipline of actually looking at numbers and actually putting propositions together probably came from that experience. And we did a strategy for Sydney, which 25 years ago it is, and it still makes sense, actually.
And I think it's important to remember you guys are really kind of breaking the ground in terms of what you're doing, particularly you, Ronnie. And it was a trip. You're the easiest to research because you've got your own Wikipedia page. So
I do?
You do? So it was a trip, though, to South Africa. Tell us about what spurred you into this direction.
Well, I had an event production company, a boutique event company, that put on beautiful events. And at every one of my events, there was food. So I had a personal challenge because I wanted to make sure nobody left my events hungry. So my tables groaned, and I was a creator of an enormous amount of food waste. And I needed a solution. So I'd put it in my car and try and take it sometimes, somewhere, which was hard to do. The trip to South Africa just actually galvanized me into action. It wasn't, I was doing this, I was thinking about what I could do with it, but seeing an activist friend of mine who had been an anti-apartheid activist and had set up a whole range of different charitable or sustainable organizations, and visiting with her just made me realize that actually thinking about rescuing food wasn't quite enough. I needed to scale it up. If I had a problem, maybe other people had a problem. And I guess almost 100 million meals later, it wasn't such a bad idea.
It's incredible testament. So Rod, I'll come back to you. We were talking around models of sustainability, and I think this is the really important is the framework and how you approach it. So mentioning the resilient city, and maybe talk us through some of the city plans and how you have much more of a human-centred approach to the environment.
So resilience is a word that's been, I suppose, emerging over the last couple of years, and it's quite difficult to come to grips with when you try and apply it to city systems. And you can apply it in a very literal way, that you harden the systems to resist shocks, which are natural events of some sort. But actually, we're more interested in the impact that those events have on people, and so the capacity of people to actually either withstand in a formal sense, that they actually have emergency services, or they've got a bushfire or whatever. And then, we've got emergency services who are pretty good in this country, denies the fact that, in fact, most of the impact is after the event. So the psychological impacts, the trauma, and the capacity of communities to respond to that varies a lot across the city. But I won't go into the full but the point about resilience is that in reconceptualising it as being, yes, we're subject to these shocks, which we've had formal systems to respond to. And then on the other hand, the social soft systems, the neighbourliness, the social cohesion, the looking out for one another, and the sheer ability of people to look after themselves ultimately, starts to mean that you've got a social justice agenda actually intersecting with, to be blunt, a sort of a productivity and really a quite mechanistic view of the city about, we want it to be productive, we don't want it to be disrupted, right? So there's a whole lot of things that flow from that. It means that no longer you're trying to design the city like a perfect machine that's 99.9% efficient, because with that comes incredible fragility, as we well know. When we try and ramp up everything so it's working perfectly, one little thing goes out and we know what happens when a pigeon lands on a high-tension wire on the railway system. Right, so that's a perfect example. So the resilience framework, which is being developed in Sydney by 100 resilient cities, so the idea of networks of information, networks of governance. It sounds all wafty and I'm waving my hands in the air because that's the diagram that it is a very different approach. It's no longer seeing the city as problems that we solve and then walk away from. It's establishing new connections, and it's actually, as I say, really building up the connection between the social objective, because ultimately, Shakespeare, in probably the least appropriate play for him to say it, in Coriolanus with his blood everywhere, what is the city but it's people? Yeah. That's what it's really about. It's putting people front and centre, and the power of that, of course, is that no longer are we separating planet from people, and you can see that in terms of political activation, political will, by putting people front and centre, people are mostly concerned about themselves. We want enlightened self-interest, and that's fine, but that's where the political power comes from. So to pretend that we can I'm not saying we should dismiss it, but rely on the pure intrinsic value of nature and expect to win the argument or paint the vision, I don't think it's going to work. So resilience, yes, there's a whole lot of formal frameworks and all the rest of it, but at its absolute core is looking after people and helping people look after themselves. And when you do that, you can see how then the system is not so good. The challenge, just I'll finish, but I think one of the challenges we've got in Australia, particularly in New South Wales, is that actually our problems are not so big that we actually do much about it. Like the systems are pretty good. They're pretty good. I'm not saying there's people who aren't really suffering at all, but there are quite a lot of safety nets. It's a pretty good society. And I will stop, but the thing that was fascinating about the Opera House again, and why I'm going to wave the hands in the air again is because our dissatisfaction and our disgruntlement and our unease is amorphous because it's not clear. So I found the Opera House thing absolutely fascinating because it was pieces, little motes in the air suddenly coming together and everyone goes, that's what we're arguing about.
Yeah.
It's just this sort of a magical moment where no one could, the individual things could not galvanise the action, but coming together, everyone was saying that there's something out of kilter here.
Claire, respond to that. You've been looking at activism. Yes.
Well, this isn't about fashion, but I'm listening to you and thinking, gosh, that's so interesting. And I wholeheartedly get behind this idea that we need to think about communities in terms of connectivity. But this idea that we have such a great easy time here, which I think can be true in some social contexts. I think it's one of the things that lets us down when it comes to climate and that's my passion, even though it's not as I said, I'm not a climate expert. I've written this book, which is a lot of it's about climate activism. And I think that one of the reasons why we don't all get up and scream about climate is that it's hard to see it. And that then we also have this kind of cushion of comfort that surrounds how we live the rest of our lives. And so we get worried about consumerism, but we can also say, never mind, let's keep spending. We do have safety nets that look after many people in society, not everyone. But climate, we should be screaming about climate just because we can't see it. I think when we talk about where the system is broken with climate. We have a government that's letting us down. We have deniers who are saying the science isn't science and it's some report. And I think that we actually need to step outside of our privilege and realise that this is a global responsibility that I'm ranting, but I'm listening to you thinking, I think that's one of the problems we've got, that we're not taking part enough when it comes to protecting our environment.
And I want to bring you, Ronnie, into that. One of our headlines was about apathy, and I think it's exactly that we live in a privileged country and things look okay when we look out. We know, I think people in the room know the stats that it's 97% of actively publishing climate scientists, which is many thousands of peer-reviewed articles, say that unequivocally that the climate is warming and it's almost entirely likely to be due to human intervention. But the Lowy Institute this year surveyed 1,200 Australians and found only 59% thought global warming was a serious and pressing problem, which is quite extraordinary. And last month, Sydney Morning Herald published about 50 scientists that just gave a scathing attack on Australians. We don't take it seriously, and perhaps same with food waste, it's all part of it. What are you coming up against with apathy?
So our biggest challenge is us.
Yeah.
We are the solution. We are the problem, but we are the solution. If $10 billion worth of food waste annually in Australia is caused by us, 10 billion of the 20 billion, 20 billion every year, 10 billion from business, industry, 10 billion from us, it would save us all. Each household could save around $4,000 a year. That's a lot of money. That's a cool holiday. We could all save if we were mindful and remembered the value of food. But we're convenience society. We're a consumer society. We want to walk into a shop at 10 o'clock at night and have the same choice at night that we have at 8 in the morning. So it's all of those things. It's apathy, but it's let somebody else, I do just want to buy cherries because I bought a recipe that says I need cherries when they're not in season, but I walk into the supermarket and they're there. Now they're there because we buy them. If we didn't buy them, they would not be on the shelves. And so every time people say to me, it's the supermarkets to blame. Supermarkets are made up of people. People are trying to sell stuff. If nobody buys stuff, people don't sell that stuff. So it's us. Yeah. So we are the solution. Instead of looking at it that we are the problem, we are the solution. We all took responsibility. Then we wouldn't have $10 billion worth of good food going to waste. So I think, we all very good at doing this. And doing this means we point at other people, but we forget that 3 fingers come back to us.
I like that.
1 goes out, but 3 come back. And so, in this room, we're talking to the converted. You are all here because you are all believers in all of the things that the 3 of us stand for. So I always feel very bad when I, blame every share that we're all responsible. But we are. We are. And until such time as we value food, are mindful of it, and understand that with every purchase, if you throw away a freckled banana, it isn't just the 80 cents or the 90 cents or the dollar that banana cost. It's the fuel, it's the labor, it's the water, it's the energy. It's everything that went into growing that banana.
And same as well for fashion. There's so many metrics that sit
so
behind.
similar.
Yeah. Exactly. And how do you then look at, there's incredibly complex ecosystems, Claire, but as far as making sustainable fashion choice, how can the economy stack up? How can we actually make that work?
Well, I loved how Ronnie turned that back on us, because I am actually very positive about this stuff. I don't think we're in a doom and gloom situation. I think that with fashion, we have agency and we can change it. And there's so much innovation happening, and there are so many people working hard to reshape the system. It's actually very exciting. So I don't feel like I'm locked in this gloomy world where we're all wasting clothes, even though we're all wasting clothes.
Yes. What's the kilograms per?
On the War on Waste in the first season, they piled up a giant mountain of clothing in Sydney CBD, and that was what Australians chuck into landfill every 10 minutes, and it was 6,000 kilograms. But the one I always love, which you could be shocked by, is, good to shock people, we, per capita, Australians consume clothing and textiles to the tune of 28 kilos a year, right? Per capita. Guess how much we chuck in landfill? It's a shocker. Go on, hands up. Yeah. Erin, 23. Erin runs an upcycled label where she uses post-consumer waste, so streetwear pieces that then she reconstructs into fantastic new garments in a really cool way. So Erin is a solution. Yeah. There are so many solutions where people are actually looking at this problem and turning it around, and it's fantastic. So how we square that is, I think education is really important, and we have to not be afraid to look at this thing head on. And we have to accept that we have a problem and this is the extent of it. And then we need to support all the people doing good stuff to reshape it. And there's loads of them. And I don't want to go on for too long, but I think one of the things that I find exciting is the idea that we might completely redesign the economy and look at how circularity could change the way that we make things. And if you want to dig deep into this, read William McDonough's extremely great book called Cradle to Cradle. Or you could listen to my podcast in which I interview him.
Wardrobe Crisis.
But it's good stuff. It's basically just, in a nutshell, it's like technical nutrients, man-made things, keep them purely technical and recycle them, keep them in the loop. And then biological nutrients, we keep them pure so that they can be returned to the earth, so we don't contaminate natural resources. And actually we can do that. Big brains can redesign how we do that. And fashion's full of creative brains. Absolutely. I feel positive about it, even though I had a rant about climate change.
So Rod, for you, I want to look a little bit more at that policy, because we're talking about motivation, but also is it a matter of carrot or stick? Should we sort of be legislating for certain behaviours or encouraging them?
Rather than see it as carrot and stick, I think there's things in the city which, I think it's fair to say that if you think of the city as having been thought of as a machine that we're trying to make more efficient, or that we want to build on strengths, well, the obverse to building on strengths is entrenching weaknesses or exacerbating weaknesses. And so it's an easy win, so we've got radial rail systems that come in and feed the city because we know the agglomeration that comes from the efficiencies of having people concentrated together, so there's plenty of metrics about that. But of course, it also then means there's people on the periphery who do have a tougher time. So that's a structural problem, that's what the whole Three Cities thing's about. I mean, whether you like the airport or not, it really is meant to be a lever, a catalyst to actually get investment out west, and it comes with a whole lot of issues and problems and challenges, I recognise that. But when you think about how do you rebalance an entire city, because Sydney's at the 4.6 million, when you get to that size in both population and in the geographic spread, it's very hard to maintain a single centre and not have this not working geographically. So that's the big move, but that's a structural investment, problem. The other change, of course, is things like policy changes, which might be, dare I say it, a price on carbon or whatever. Those things go right through the economy and change things that are viable or not viable at the moment. They change the cost effectiveness. Without subsidies and all the rest of it, without the carrot, that in itself will actually start to mean that the whole economy shifts because what makes sense changes. And then the last thing is to throw it back to you on fashion, which I think is this question of, people talk about lifestyle, but if we think about patterns of living and what is both possible because of the infrastructure, but also what's desirable through looking at peers and leaders and, what's cool and what's actually seen to be acceptable, or more than acceptable, desirable. And I'll use the example of veganism.
I was going to use the example of getting the bus.
I got it. Snap.
Get in the bus.
Well, because the thing is that I think I've got the figures right. It's increased like 5 times, and it's quite significant in the States now. The effect of that might sound weird, but it's actually similar to the effect of the renewable energy target on the take-up of photovoltaics. Because once you start saying, look, this is desirable, then we know that vegan products, which, emulate meat products, which I don't personally have a problem with at all. I think that's fantastic, that's creative. But they're expensive at the moment. But once it starts to become a big alternative, I think we can expect those prices and processes and all of the innovation about how we produce food is just going to be radically transformed. And it does then go to what's cool. And therefore, the celebrity thing in the States with vegans, is there any film star now that isn't a vegan? That's fantastic.
And Ronnie, maybe you could jump in on that with food trends. And what's the future of food? Do you think this sustainability is really coming into its own?
Not yet. I think we've still got a way to go. I do think that this whole plant-based and vegan movement is definitely growing, but it's still very marginal. We hear a lot about it because the celebrities talk about it, but, we've got a long way to go. I think, again, it's all about balance, and it's all about managing our food supply, and it's about, when I say the system is broken, if we don't sell off our farms, if we don't value our farms in the first place, how do we, if we now importing more than we are producing, that's a system that's broken. When we have all the resources, if we don't make our soil nutritious, then we're not growing food that is nutritious. So we everywhere along the supply chain is not functioning the way it should function. But education is the tool. For us, this is the first time that Oz Harvest in its 14 years has actually launched a consumer campaign. So for 14 years, we've trained business, and we've got thousands of businesses on board to not throw away their food and to make sure that it gets repurposed. But we hadn't targeted consumers because we just didn't have the resources. But we've reached a point that we have launched the first national consumer campaign to fight food waste. So you are not leaving here today without becoming food fighters. And we are looking for a super food fighter force, an army, because talk about human-centered behavior and design, we need all of us to teach other people how to live sustainably and how to manage our own waste. And we have a new mantra, look, buy, store, cook. You all learned slip, slop, slap. We all learned it. Now we have to learn look, buy, store, cook. And that's look what you've got in your fridge before you go shopping. Look what's in your pantry before you go shopping. Look what you own, what you have. Buy what you need. Store it properly. The freezer is a pause button. And cook what you bought and make sure you use it and turn it into leftovers. And so, that's all of us can do that. And that is, we've got 35 or 45,000 people have signed up so far. We need to create 1 million of us, and then 2 million. And so we need each of you to share that with 10 people, and we're willing to train you. And so we're putting into place literally an army of citizens that can shift and change all of our behavior, because that's what's going to make the difference. Oh. Join us.
Reading through Rise and Resist, there's some incredible creative tactics to make change. So maybe, Claire, you can tell us some practical things, I guess, in the fashion world, but also outside of that.
Well, it's all about exactly what you were talking about. It's about community and about join us, right? Humans yearn for connection. And I think that actually, if you bring this down to two things, what you said about community, Ronnie, but also about common sense. Sustainability is actually just common sense. It's not rocket science. It's not sustainable to throw all the food out of your fridge that you actually spent money on. It's also not very smart. It's not good common sense. And actually, those two things are really, really obvious things. They're just, we can all get our heads around them. Forget like the scary climate science. I mean, it's good to have a grasp of that. But actually, this is just, you know, get together with your communities, foster those relationships that actually we feel poorer for if we don't have, and apply a bit of common sense onto how to live more lightly on this planet. And there's going to be 9 billion of us soon, so we need to live more lightly on this planet. I think we need to think very carefully about the serious stuff, about how we gobble up fossil fuels in the sunniest country in the world, where we could be relying on safe, renewable natural energy. That's just my thing. But whatever your thing is, find your thing. If it's food, if it's making a more sustainable, connected city, if it's mending or sewing, doesn't matter what it is. Whatever it is that floats your boat, that gets you feeling connected to something that matters more than just what's on the telly. Yes. Get in there and do it. And so you asked me what were some creative examples in the book. I'll just mention one. So I started writing this book thinking about the women's marches that happened the day after Trump's inauguration. Eek. That was the catalyst, thinking not just about Trump, although please, I'm reading that bloody book, Michael Wolff.
Michael.
I'm taking Trump to bed. Have you seen his face? That's not common sense.
To bed every night.
He's taking me to bed. Trump sideline. But the impetus for this book was not Trump. It was about all these people taking to the streets globally, 5 million people, not just women, just people taking to the streets in solidarity saying, we don't like this conversation that's about exclusion, that's about demonizing the other, that's about creating an unsustainable world. That's not common sense and it's not connection. And I then took that jumping off point to go into a weird deep dive into craftivism.
Yes. Tell us about craftivism.
Well, it's just this idea that you can be an activism in any way you see fit that suits your personality, and not everyone wants to chant with a placard. And so I explored the story of Sarah Corbett, who started a thing in London called the School of Gentle Activism, where she stitches her rebellion. Embroidery, man. You can do it. You can change the world with knitting. I'll leave you to Google that or read it in the book.
And I think that's what I really loved as well. It's about finding your tribe and your way of actually making a difference. There's incredibly great, brave people on the front line, and I think it's actually everyone needs to have an involvement. So I might end, Rod, with you, because if we look at, we're all part of Greater Sydney, and you said we're just under 5 million people. There's another 3 million coming in the next 40 years. How can we not consume our natural resources? Like, what's the solution for that many people coming into this huge corridor?
I didn't know you were going to ask that question.
What's your plan, Mr. Simpson?
Well, I've spoken a bit about it. I think...
How can we protect the environment? Because ultimately that's what we're thinking about, the natural environment.
Well, I mean, it depends on the scale. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So in terms of the bottom up, one of the things that we're not responsible for it, but we try and encourage or support. So swimming in Parramatta River is a really nice example. So if you say that you want to swim in Parramatta River, of course the consequences of that flow right up to the watershed, so you've got to think about the whole catchment. So by narrowing it down to what sounds like a very simple thing, actually has profound implications for then how you need to talk to, in the case of the Parramatta River Master Plan, which has got a vision to be able to swim in the river, 35 organisations, including 11 councils who are responsible for it. But it's all coming from this idea that we need to protect the river, we need to clean it up. It's already got a lot cleaner in the last few years. And so there's no I guess what I'm saying is there's no single answer. It's almost what turns, literally floats your boat in the case of the river, or what swims, what you want to swim in. And so...
Yeah, where's your entry point?
Yeah, and so I think that really recognising that there are multiple entry points, that there are these communities of interest, and there will be things that just become touch points. So the Opera House thing was a sort of a negative touch point, but may have ripples that extend out and allow people to articulate things about what they're not happy about. But on the other hand, let's call it the vision, the aspiration to be able to swim in the river, on the other hand, has actually a whole lot of bureaucratic implications. I mean, it actually means that then there's people who have the political will, or you're looking for funds and so on. And there's multiple activities like that. I mean, and it's just speaking about Liverpool for a moment, because Jane did. It's the idea of the city, in particularly Sydney. We're hyper diverse socially. I know you've heard that, but I mean, it's not even the ethnicity or where you were born or whatever. It's hyper diverse in terms of the patterns of living that are possible in different parts of the city. And so in Liverpool, I think it's about 13% of people walk to work. You think, hang on, Liverpool, this is the city centre. It's not the whole LGA, local government area, but why? Well, and how many people own cars? It's really low car ownership. Why? Well, because there's a hospital there which provides a whole lot of employment. It's got 2 high schools, so the kids also walk to school. In other words, and I won't go on and on about it, but the patterns of living that are possible in Liverpool, the fact that you've got so many people on the streets, walking the streets, as opposed to driving into an underground car park, means that there's a potential for an emergence there, which then becomes council's role is not one of directing and designing, and it's really much more a matter of cultivating, encouraging the things that are emerging that you want, and just slowing down some of the things that you don't particularly want to encourage.
And I think that fits across almost the theme. It's the decentralising of power in a way. It's actually, rather than top down, it's people, individuals taking control and changing the system.
Who's responsible for sidewalks? How can we get our sidewalks filled with beautiful produce instead of crap grass that needs to be watered and Just do it. Just take it over. I mean, I understand. I've done it, but there are councils that fine people and come and tell you that you can't grow fruit and veg in your front sidewalk, that it's not yours.
I feel this is a fight Ronnie's going to win.
Yeah, my next fight.
I'm going to throw it open for maybe 2 questions from the audience. So has anyone got a question for this panel? Dimity.
Just the campaign that you just talked about.
Fight food waste. Look, buy, store, cook.
Where will we see that rolling out? JC Depot, advertorial, or like where are we going to see it?
Say that louder.
For those who didn't come tonight, where are the common folk going to learn about this campaign?
From you. You're going to tell your network, and you're going to tell yours, and you're going to tell yours, but it's on our website.
Yeah.
So it's called Fight Food Waste, fightfoodwaste.com. No.org. And we will be screaming it from the treetops, but we need people power.
It needs to be on your van.
Standing
in traffic, you can see them.
Beautiful.
It needs to be a partnership with Coles and like the big supermarkets.
Yeah, no, we do have it. Yeah, we do.
Who are we to tell
but
Ronnie? She knows it.
But I like it. Okay.
Another question.
I like it. JC Deco, here I come.
Curry Bank.
Georgia.
So I've got a question about, it seems like the solution seems to be localizing. So we want to upcycle the clothes that are already here. We want to, buy local produce instead of buying stuff that comes from overseas, reducing food miles and things like that. And I was just interested in what you think all of you actually think our responsibility is to the third world countries and the developing countries where we're getting our cherries from in the middle of winter and where we're getting who are making all of our clothes, and what are our responsibilities to them to help them through this process of getting more local?
Good one for you.
Well, I can speak about that from a fashion context. And while I happen to be a fan privately of radical localism as an idea, and I think that we could re-energise our communities with a bit of that thinking, global fashion is a giant industry and it employs 80 million garment workers worldwide, most of whom are women with children and most of whom are not paid a living wage. Bangladesh alone employs 4 million garment workers. If we boycott made in Bangladesh, then you're going to see 4 million garment workers out of employment and on the streets. So we shouldn't be boycotting. And the solutions are very complex. And I mean, I don't have all the answers, but I certainly don't believe that we should be, for example, only shopping local for anything, because the global community is interconnected, and our buying decisions have impacts on people on the other side of the world. But I think we need to make those decisions mindfully, so that we're ensuring that workers are treated with dignity, not that they're completely wiped out of the picture. And we only make 8% of clothes in Australia that are sold in Australian stores. So let's face it, 92% of the clothing that we consume is produced offshore. So I still think you can back radical localism in that context, because we're not going to shift that completely, are we? I mean, we might nudge it slightly.
I think there's a couple of answers to that too. I think that even though we're talking about bottom up, I think there's clearly a role for understanding what the hell's going on in the city, which is our role. So, but rather than command and control, it's really, if we think of it more as cultivation or as, a soft touch, and then really, but also then providing the bones, the skeleton, the hard infrastructure, which we have to do. But from the international perspective, I think you can take two approaches to that. You can take a totally self-interested, very reductionist approach, which would be the instability that's going to come from climate change. And it's not just me saying that. So the most recent Foreign Affairs white paper and the most recent Defence white paper, one was 2 years ago, one was about 18 months ago, identify the disruption globally from climate change refugees as being the premier security threat. Right? Full stop. Worldwide, but also in our Southeast Asian region. Doesn't pull any punches. And so from a very self-interested, very mechanistic, if you like, or reductionist, there's that. And then, of course, there's on the other side, we're human and there's empathy, but I think you can come at it again from both sides. It's really no question that we can't allow that disruption to occur, because it will impact us directly anyway, leaving aside any humanistic or humanitarian or empathy aspect. There's a sort of really
there's also a responsibility. Sorry to interrupt you, but there's also a responsibility. We have to face up to our global responsibility that climate change was caused by us. It was not caused by the workers who are mostly women in Bangladesh on the front line of sea level rise. So as a global community, I think that we have a responsibility to recognise that we...
Where we can always, grow our own stuff and go, we're all good now, but
And Ronnie, did you want to have the final word?
A positive one, please.
I do think we have to be mindful of food miles, regardless. I wish I could believe that we were all so mindful that we'd affect the global economy of other countries. It's going to take us a long time. We are very resistant to change, and yet we've so quickly got used to overconsumption, consumerism, and having everything. So it's just so interesting how quickly over the last few hundred years we've become who we are today, and yet to shift that is the hardest thing. We're working with behavioral logistics, human-centered design specialists, and I can tell you to get us to shift our behavior is frickin' difficult. But yeah, I've got one more thing that I'm going to need you all to do, because we've got have we got 8 hours left till? Yeah, okay. So I don't know if any of you have heard about the Google Impact Challenge. Yes. Cool. So OzHarvest is shortlisted, and there is a People's Choice that will allow us to win $1 million tomorrow. Wow. So you got to go onto our website, click on
tonight.
vote.
Yeah, yes.
Now?
Yeah, well, you can just.
Now
This is practical activism.
let us out. It's done.
I'm not letting you out. You go onto the OzHarvest website, click on vote, then click on vote now, and that will give us the ability to deliver a digital platform to reach the 1.5 million Australians in rural and regional Australia that suffer from immense food insecurity, and that isn't counting the farmers. This was measured before the drought.
This room could be the tipping point. Tell
It
your friends, tell
could
everyone.
be.
Well,
No,
please thank my panel. I think it's incredible. We could talk forever. Ronnie, Rod, and Claire. We have 2 boxes of Claire's books here. Maddie's going to be at the front there. You can pay by card or credit. It's $30, which is cheaper than anywhere else. It's on a little discount here. And she will sign it. So if you want a book, you can't get out unless you pass through that door. Take the book and then come, and Claire will be sitting on the stage and we'll sign that for you. And also, please do sign up and vote for OzHarvest. I think it's doing incredible work. Thank you.